This is Creating a Family. Talk about foster, adoptive, and kinship care. Welcome back to our regular listeners. We really appreciate how you have helped us grow. We are now in the top 10% of all podcasts, actually in the world, believe it or not. And we also want to send out a special hello to our new listeners. We do want to grow and reach more families, so we really appreciate you joining us. I am Dawn Davenport. I am the host of the show as well as the director of the nonprofit, creatingafamily.org. Today, we're going to be talking about what parents need to know about today's teens and sex. And stick around to the end because we're going to be giving practical suggestions along the way, which I think is especially helpful. We will be talking today with Dr. Debbie Herbenick. She is a provost professor at the Indiana University School of Public Health in Bloomington, where she leads the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behavior. She is an award-winning sexuality educator and a researcher, and she is the author of the book, Yes, Your Kid, What Parents Need to Know About Today's Teens and Sex. Welcome, Dr. Herbenick, to Creating a Family. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So basically, part of your job, and I realize it covers a whole lot more than just this, but part of your job is to help parents navigate the conversations with their child around bodies and sexuality. And it seems like this book was designed to say to parents, talking about puberty and sexuality may feel awkward, but you can do it. You should do it. And here's how. And I particularly appreciated the "and here's how" part, because that's, I think, what most of us really need as parents. And I'm a mom of four, so I know what I speak about. What I particularly appreciated is that this book is up to date about what is really happening in the world of teens and sex. And I'm sure it's based on your work, both as a college professor, but also from the National Survey of Sexual Health and Behaviors. Did that influence how you viewed what's actually happening? Because honestly, I think that some of us, and I'm raising my hand here, are naive as to what is really happening in the world. And both exaggerating it and both ways. We cut both ways.
Yeah, I think most of us are really naive. It just so happens to be that I study sex. And of course, I do teach college students. And so I hear from them. I learn through my research. And so I get this inside view to what's really happening with teenagers and young adults. And that is exactly why I wanted to write Yes, Your Kid, because I thought, what many of us as parents would otherwise be talking about are kind of a lot of the same old things that we thought kids needed when we were their age, about puberty and about some of the basics around sexuality and maybe STIs, preventing pregnancy, things like that. And all of that's still really important, but it's not enough in today's world where most kids have access to a smartphone, where there's widespread social media, where there's access to pornography and changing kinds of pornography. So we really need to understand what the real sexual landscape is, whether or not our kids are engaging in those behaviors, they're aware of them, they may be thinking about them. So it's important to step into those conversations.
Yeah, and I think that most parents believe, if asked, that their kids are not engaged, are not thinking, are not aware. So I think it's important to realize that even if our kids are not engaging in any of the things we're going to be talking about, it's still important for us as parents to be aware, because even if they aren't doing it, they probably know someone who is, and they're probably thinking about a lot more than we think they are thinking about. What do you believe a parent's role should be in sex education? I know it's kind of a softball question, but it seems like it is a fundamental, kind of foundational to this discussion.
It is, every parent has a role in sex education, whether or not they realize it, whether or not they're having active conversations. We all do. We have a role in sex education in terms of how we model things for them, how we model things around gender or sexuality in our home, the kinds of music we listen to, the sorts of, movies we might show and TV shows in the house. I mean, kids are learning from the earliest ages what the people and the family members around them think about sexuality. So even when we nervously sidestep conversations, if maybe there's a sexual scene that comes on a show and, you say, oh, change the station. Well, the child may learn from you, right, that is something shameful or it's not right for them or something. But unless you really sort of expand on that as a teachable moment, they may not know why. So we always have a role anyway, But what I want to encourage parents to do is have a more active role in talking with their kids about bodies, puberty, sexuality, because they're getting information from all sorts of sources around, whether it's friends, media, their school. And so, in terms of really talking about values, in terms of putting it in the context of their lives, in terms of supporting your child because you know your child better than anyone else, you have a really, really, really important role to support them in navigating what can be a very tricky space for most young people.
Mm-hmm. You talk about the value of becoming an askable parent. What do you mean by that?
By an askable parent, it's a parent that kids can go to with questions, with concerns, with maybe even things that their friends need help with something they don't really understand that they saw or heard about. So being an askable parent is just somebody that you can go to that's not going to shut you down right away, that says, oh, like, that's a good question. What have you heard about that? Or what do you know about that? But kind of keeps the conversation going so that you maintain a connection with your child at different ages and stages, and you can be that person that they come to.
So let's say you have a child, a teen, let's say a 14-year-old, that comes to you and asks a question, and you're startled by the question. You haven't thought, you weren't planning on having this conversation for another couple of years, if ever. Or maybe you were hoping to pawn it off to your partner if you have one. And so the kid comes and asks you a question. What are some responses that you can use in the heat of the moment, have them tucked in your back pocket, that will help you not shut down the conversation, will help you learn a little more, and maybe buy you a little time while you think about how you want to handle it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think go-tos are, like, that's a good question. I mean, really, just
Yeah,
like that.
that's a great one. You said it in the book, and I thought, oh, that's a good one. Darn, I don't think I used that. Yes.
Yeah, just a few seconds. They're like, if you don't know the answer, then you can be like, I don't really know. What have you heard about that? Where did this come up from? Sometimes the questions are actually really innocuous and you're thinking they mean one thing and they mean
Yeah.
something totally different.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that does buy you a little time, and it also gives you a little context of where they might have heard about this thing, from, because that happens to all of us. And that happens to the most seasoned sex educators and sex researchers like me. Sometimes I've gotten questions where I didn't think I was going to get that for a few more years. And so, so having that question, but I think really, again, supporting their curiosity. We wouldn't shut down their curiosity in other areas of life. So let's not do that in sexuality. So, good question. Like, I don't know, what have you heard? What do you think about that? What's your best guess about that? Sort of depending on, what the question is. But the main thing is we don't want to shut it down. They are going to ask lots of questions. If we're lucky, like, we want them to come to us with questions.
Yeah.
So if we're lucky, they are coming with questions. And, we are sometimes going to shut it down, even when we don't mean to. And we're going to react in a way that later we think, oh, I really wish I hadn't done that. And there we have an opportunity to repair and reconnect. And so we come back later and you say, I really was surprised when you asked me that question, or when you mentioned this thing, that your friend said or did. It brought up a lot of things for me. This was unfamiliar to me. I'm really sorry. Can we have a second chance
Yeah.
at that conversation? And that models for your child how you deal with conflict, how you deal with like mistakes that you made, and it gives you a chance to start over. So that's the valuable lesson. But then you get to step back into that conversation and maybe the way you wish you had done the first time. Maybe you've now had a chance to talk it through with a partner if you have one, or a good friend or a family member, or you've looked it up and learned more about something that you had never heard about before. And now, now you have some more information to go into that conversation with. So it's also okay to come back into something that didn't go the way you wanted to initially.
Well, and the other thing is, if you truly don't know the answer, admitting it and saying, I don't know the answer. Let's figure out how to find the answer. And that opens up an opportunity, particularly when you're looking up something online. There is so much, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but there is so many obviously not reputable places that our kids could get answers. But there are ways. Internet literacy is something, this is not the purpose of this show, but I think it's something that we as parents overlook so often. We need to teach our kids to look at the .org, .edu, .gov sites and tell them that otherwise, chances are good, most .coms are trying to sell you something or getting you to come back to this site. And if you're really looking for answers, that's not what you're looking for. So let's look it up together. Yes, this is awkward. And yes, this can be embarrassing. What about admitting that up front about when you have conversations with your kids about, Because it is awkward. It's talking about naked bodies, and at some point they're going to connect that mom and dad, if mom and dad were in the picture for this, did something that was like this, and they had to get naked, and it's uncomfortable. So, what about just acknowledging the awkwardness?
It can be awkward for some families some of the time. It doesn't have to be, but it can be for some of us.
Valid point.
And so I think for people who are feeling awkwardness, especially over, we all have certain topics that might feel more awkward or sensitive for us than others. So it's also okay to say things like, this is kind of new for me. It feels a little awkward because it's new for me because maybe like when I grew up, my parents didn't talk with me about these things. And so these conversations are still kind of new for me, but they're also really important to me because I want us to have an open conversation in our family, right? So it's okay to talk about this, or this is awkward for me because this stuff wasn't going on when I was a kid. Like none of us had smartphones or none of us had access to some of these things. And
It might have been going on. You might not have known about it.
might not have known.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so some of it is just kind of sharing why, because again, that gives practice and modeling for talking about your feelings. And also that even though you're feeling that discomfort, that you can get through it, that you have the confidence as a parent and a family member that you can get through this because it's really important to you.
I think one of the challenges is how to talk with kids about sex without sounding overly judgmental, but also to convey your values. Any suggestions there?
I think that's where those time-tested I messages really come up because you can share your values with like how you feel by saying like, well, I feel this, or in my view, whatever. So you talk about, your own sense of it. But I would be really careful about blanket messages about this is always wrong or this is always bad, because again, you don't want to shut your child out of a future conversation with you. So acknowledging your discomfort, acknowledging how you feel, acknowledging where your perspectives come from, still makes space for their perspectives. They may end up landing in a few days or a few hours or a few weeks or years where you are, but they may not initially. And I think that can be really hard, when sometimes people just say, this is always terrible or always wrong. But I know as a college professor, what I hear from my students is that they often stop talking with a person who just sort of paints such a broad swath that there's no room for them. Or they say, I can't really talk to this person, so I just tell them I'm not having sex, right? Because they're just going to tell me like it's wrong if I do. And so that's the side that I think I've been a college professor now. I've been teaching college sexuality classes for 21 years to many thousands of students. And they write their first person accounts in their papers and talk about things in class. So, I think it depends on what kind of, I guess, message you want to share with your child. If you just want them to know, well, you can tell them, and that's your right. But I'll say from the other side of things, what I see is if they feel like they're only going to be judged or shamed, they will stop telling that person the reality of their life. And that's really hard.
You talk in the book, and I really love this idea, about 5-minute a week conversations. I thought that was such a good idea. It would have been a good idea for me. I didn't do it. I didn't know about it, doggone it. Let's talk about what do you mean by a 5-minute a week conversation? How does that apply, obviously?
Every family's got to find their way in, right? And so some families do these 5-minute a week conversations where they may say, anyone can do anything for 5 minutes. So my kid and I can talk about whatever it is, sort of this broader idea of, bodies, puberty, sexuality, relationships for 5 minutes a week. So you say to your child, I know that sometimes this can be awkward, but it's really important to me that we talk about relationships and sexuality and bodies. So once a week for 5 minutes, I'm going to set a timer and we're going to talk about something in the space. You can ask me a question or I can bring something up. We'll find a way, but we're just going to keep that conversation going for 5 minutes. When the timer goes off, it's done. And we can keep talking if you want, or you can go off and do whatever else you're doing with your day. And so it can be a little awkward the first time or two for some families, but it often really picks up. And sometimes, you can use that space to share information that you want to share, to just ask them if they have something on their mind. And I know families who sometimes say, use it as a time to ask their child something that they don't know about, right? Teenagers have all kinds of terms these days that were not popular terms when we were growing up. So, I have one friend, for example, who she decided to try this strategy with her family this year. And she said, I've heard the term pansexual. I don't know what that means to her 13-year-old. And her 13-year-old educated her on what he's heard pansexual mean. And they had this whole conversation about gender and sexuality where she learned about kind of the teenage perspective on these things.
And the thing about the 5 minute a week is that if you're committed to it, it forces the conversation to keep moving and keep growing, but it's time limited because everybody there, you could say, and we can survive a 5 minutes. If this is and your point's well taken. For not every family is this awkward, but for plenty of families it is. And I would argue that for the vast majority of teenagers it is. So anybody can survive 5 minutes. So they'll give you that 5 minutes, and then if it goes on, it goes on. But if it stops, they know that they're in control of it at that point. Something that you brought up in the book, and I may say the title again, Yes, Your Kid. Something that you brought up in Yes, Your Kid is the importance of having high quality books on puberty and sexuality around the house. If parents are not doing that, it is such an easy and important thing that you can do. Just leaving them around, and there's so many good ones that exist. You list a number of them in the back of Yes, Your Kid, so people can find them there. We've had conversations. We have a very large Facebook support group. You can come on facebook.com/groups creating a family and ask there, and you will get so many suggestions of really high quality books. And I certainly know that in our house, there was a place they were just sitting, and I would note that they were gone, and then they would come back. And that allowed my kids to explore, and I controlled the books that were there, and they were good and they were high quality. So anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think that's the big thing, right? Like you get to make the choices about what books are there. So you know that it's good information. You have them available. And it also can help deter kids from so much internet searching. Not that they're not going to search on the internet for things, or their friends might. But now when they want to know, they can read a book. And the key is to keep them updated, right? Because the books that are really helpful when our kids are in elementary age are not going to be the same when they need more information around puberty or start having questions about sexuality later on. So just from time to time, check in. That's a great idea to ask the Facebook group for tips. Look through the books yourself, see what you think, and then make them available and have them around. And if there are parts you really, really, really want your kids to know about, you can even put a sticky note in some of the parts, or say, as part of your 5 minutes a week, hey, did you check out this piece? I think it's important. But have them available and update them as they grow older.
Yeah, especially the updating them as they grow older part is such a good point. So when should parents start talking about sex? Not puberty. Puberty is one puberty is happening. You have to start talking about it. It seems to me puberty is the easier of the two to talk about for most parents, most people I know, and certainly probably for myself as well. But I'm talking about sex. When should you start talking about sex with kids? And what do we mean when we say talking about sex?
Yeah, talking about sex means lots of different things, but I
Right.
think that, one of the earlier introductions is when kids get curious about how babies are made. So many, many families start talking with kids about at least reproductive aspects of sex around ages 5 or 6. That's often when the questions come up, where they're in a more detailed way. But not all kids do. And so if some kids haven't asked those questions and they're, 7 or 8, I would bring it up to them. And again, hopefully they've had a book by then anyway that would explain that. A lot of the early books about bodies and different body parts and how babies are made. I mean, they do talk about that. They don't go into great detail.
Right.
But, so we're thinking for every topic, we're thinking about what's age appropriate and developmentally appropriate. And those early books and those early questions from kids, I mean, when they ask how babies are made, you can kind of keep it really simple about eggs and sperm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point when they're a little ready, sometimes kids will say, I mean, I get that there's egg and I get that there's sperm, but how does the egg, the sperm get to each other? And then you have more of an opportunity for talking about sex and for talking about intercourse. And again, this is where you start to also bring in more to the story with your values as well. And so, for some families, they're going to say, well, in the context of marriage or when people really love one another. And some people, keep it very sciencey based about the egg and the sperm and intercourse. And so families will differ in how they deliver that message. But it does start to make sense for kids, because otherwise it's just this completely unclear information. And we don't want to keep things unclear where then they're asking everyone around or they get
Uh-huh.
confused. So go ahead and give them the information. They are ready for it at those ages. They may even ask a little bit younger if somebody in their family is pregnant or their teacher is pregnant. So questions change, but if they're not asking in elementary, ages 7, 8, I would more clearly give them that information because they probably are getting it from someone if
Yeah.
it isn't you.
I was told, actually, it was at a seminar at our church, said, this when my kids were little, that if you haven't spoken to your child about the basics, we're not talking about getting graphic here, by the ages of 7 or 8, the chances are extremely good that they have heard from someone else. So if you want to be the first one to talk to them about it, you have to initiate the conversation. And it took me by surprise. I thought, oh my gosh, 6, 7, or 8. But does that fly with what you hear as well?
Absolutely. I mean, if they haven't asked by then, they're almost certainly getting that information from
Hmm.
somebody.
Incorrectly, probably, but
Yeah, could be good information, could not be, and you don't know, but you have no idea and you don't know the context. And so again, if you want to give the context and your values in those conversations, be part of it. And that's for any conversation, whether it's sexuality or puberty or really specific parts of sex. If you know something is coming down the pike, try to be the first person who, a year or two earlier. I mean, with puberty, we say talk at least 2 years before you think you're going to need it, because first of all, puberty is unpredictable. No one knows when, all these things
good
are coming
point.
down. But the other thing is you want your child to be prepared and have enough time to digest it and to kind of understand what's happening so that when those changes start happening to themselves or their peers, they're not really surprised or scared or worried about their body and their health.
So you would say for the puberty discussion, 9, 10.
I mean, I started talking to my kids at even younger ages about the
Uh-huh.
basics because they would wonder why my body was different than theirs.
Yeah.
And I would say something as simple as, oh, well, it's because, you go through puberty around, ages like 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And these different things happen. And they were too young to soak in much, but they took in a little bit and it would
Hmm.
come up every now and then. And as they got older, I gave them more information and we talked more about what they could expect and when, so that, by the time those changes happened with their classmates, it wasn't surprising or scary. Some
Hmm.
of my college students, if no one ever talked with them, they worried that they were hemorrhaging when they got their first period,
Hmm.
or they worried that they broke their body, like their penis, when they had their first ejaculation.
Hmm.
And they really lived with shame and worry, sometimes that they were dying. I mean, for
Hmm.
months, they worried, like, what
Yeah.
did I do to myself? And so let's talk well in advance, with them, because not all schools do, but we can at least sort of give them some information so they know what to expect.
And that follows for all big topics that we have to bring up with our kids, or that we as parents have an obligation, or I believe we have an obligation to talk with our kids about, is to start small. And we say age appropriate. Doesn't have to be much information, but if anything, when you start when they're very little, it's helping you because you're getting over some of the awkwardness and you're not giving much information, but you're just laying the groundwork. And then each time it comes back up, and oftentimes some kids ask questions, but truthfully, some kids don't. And so next time you have to bring it up or they ask a question, they've got something that you've given them the information about. So you're just adding context as they get older, as opposed to having the conversation. It should be a series, and you talk about this in the book, that it's a series of multiple conversations, with the first ones being just very simplistic.
Very, because they don't need a lot of information when they're really little. I mean, like I said, I would say, oh, it's just because I've gone through puberty already, right? And these changes happen. That's it. And you build and you build. So you set that foundation and you grow it over time. And, along with keeping things simple, when kids ask a question, we always say as sexuality educators, just answer the question you were asked. You don't have to go into a long monologue about it. They really, if they want to know how babies are made at young ages, they're really pretty happy with like egg and sperm, and you don't need more until they ask more. If they want to know more, they'll ask more, but usually they move on to some other question or some other comment, or they go back and playing, or they go back to hanging out with their friends. So just answer the question you're asked.
And keep it simple and let them know that this goes back to being the askable parent. Check in with them and say, did I answer your question? And yeah. Let me pause here for a moment to tell you about a new podcast. It's actually not new. We've been doing it for almost a year. It's called Weekend Wisdom. The important part is that this podcast, Weekend Wisdom, is where we answer your questions. So we need you to send us your questions. We have gotten some really great questions lately. Send them in. It's a short podcast, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, where we answer the questions you send to us. We take one question per Weekend Wisdom. Send your questions to info@creatingafamily.org. Now I want to move into as our children are getting older. And one of the things that seems that our society has shifted, and I'm not sure that it's clear, and that is how to talk with our young people about consent. There was a period of time where some university was saying that before ever you had to say, is this okay? Do I have your consent? For everything, like, okay, now I want to kiss you on the lips. Do I have your consent? Now I want to stroke your hair. Do I have your consent? And I'm thinking, that is just simply unrealistic. That is not how romance works. But we all know consent is important. So how do we talk with both our sons and our daughters about consent now?
Yeah, I mean, consent is something that is much more common in schools these days. I mean, just completely apart from sexuality, making sure, you have your permission, your friend's permission to go through their backpack and their cubby. I mean, even at young ages, like, didn't give your permission. So I think, many schools are trying to sort of broaden consent. And again, I think at those early ages, we can even do that in homes. And so, like, is it all right if I give you a hug? Because not all kids feel like a hug. First of all, some have sensory issues and don't always want a hug, or they might want a hug, but not a really tight, squeezy hug, or they might not feel like one if they're really upset right then, right? And they might want a little space for a minute. So it's not taking things too far to sometimes just say, like, do you feel like a hug right now? And that can become really normalized in families. But as they get older and we really start thinking in more detailed ways and start connecting it to sexuality in their early teens, I mean, we really want them to know early on, and probably even before your early teens, but middle school age and so on, that you ask before you kiss somebody. There's a great book. Oh, it's one of the Kelly Yang books. I can't remember which one it is now, but you follow the characters at different ages. She's this great New York Times bestselling author of these kid books, these elementary age kids books. But in one of them, the boy character ends up kissing the girl character without talking about it. And she's upset because she thought they were just friends, for a few years, and she gets this kiss. And so that book is a kid's book, an older kid's book, fifth, sixth grade. But I think it does a really nice job about talking about the feelings involved about that from both sides. And then also how to talk with somebody when it hasn't gone the way that you thought it would, right? And what it means. So talking about permission, talking about consent as they get older, making sure that they know that consent is not enough, where we see a lot of things go wrong in the teen years and with college students too, is they say, no, it was fine. Like, she or he said yes, or she or he said it was okay. But did they seem like they wanted you to? Did they seem like they liked it, right? So we do talk about like meaningful consent or enthusiastic consent versus just consent. Because people, when they're pressured into something, will say yes. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't mean they want to be doing that thing. And so we really want to make sure that we're talking about that as well. One saying that we've had in our house that actually started in relation to like how we manage the family pets, is like carrying the cats all around, is letting is not liking. Just because someone lets you do something doesn't mean they like it. So we would say with our cats, right? Like, look at their ears. Like, do their ears tell you that they want to be, held that way right now? If not, you put them down. And as a college professor, I ended up using that cat phrase that we developed at home with my students.
But I think it's great.
Because you can look right at body language and you can say, do they really look happy right now? Do they look like they're into this? If not, step back, you don't have to do the next thing.
So one difference for a lot of people who are raising children now, particularly teens, is that when they were teens, technology was totally different. And now we've got the internet, we have social media, so many, it's almost ubiquitous now, everybody's got a cell phone. So how has technology in general impacted, let's say, sexual development of our kids?
Wow. I mean, I think nothing else in history, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's really something. And so, with technology, we have, of course, not only access to finding out information, which we've talked a little bit about, that, people will search the internet for information about bodies and sexuality, but also for how you flirt with each other, how you meet partners. So it brings up all kinds of issues around, taking and sharing of nude images, what we sometimes call sexting, or of course, access to pornography as well.
We're going to talk about that in a minute. You're right, because I want to spend some time on both of those.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, yes, both getting information, but also just viewing images. All of that it is so different now from when. So, what are some reasonable parental rules surrounding technology use?
Yeah, they really vary by age, like anything else. And I think at the youngest ages, a lot of parents just try to keep their kids away from the internet and away from connected devices. When they start to spend time on them, parents commonly say, sure, you can be on the tablet or on my phone, but you need a grown up in the room. I need to be able to have the device in view. And then you sort of build things up over time. And that's, I would say, the more common strategy. I think we're seeing some changes these days, even around access to devices, because there is a lot more research than we had, even 5 years ago, that shows some real challenges with mental health and distractibility for young people. So most kids do have access to a smartphone or a connected device by age 12, but many more families are realizing maybe there's some wisdom in delaying access to those devices.
That's interesting. And you're seeing that in your survey that parents are
Yeah.
interesting.
And many schools right now, we're starting to see many more phone-free
Yeah.
schools.
Hmm.
So I think, we are starting to see a change in reaction to what a lot of my college students will describe themselves as feeling like their generation was the guinea pig, where these
Yeah.
things were just widespread access. And, my 22-year-old college students will say things like, gosh, when we were 12, all these things happened. And when I have kids, I'm not going to give them the same access that I had.
Interesting. That is fascinating. And they're right. They were the guinea pigs. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. You are probably learning a lot in this podcast. I know that I am, especially today, learning a lot. In addition, we want you to know, however, that we have a new training that we're offering for prenatal substance exposure. A lot of our kids have been exposed to alcohol and drugs during pregnancy. It impacts their behavior, it impacts their learning. We have a workshop for parents. It is a great resource for you. It's 4.5 hours. It's over 3 sessions. It's broken out by age of the child. It's just terrific. You can get more information at bit.ly/prenatal-exposure-training. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/prenatal-exposure-training. Now, I want to talk specifically about taking and sharing sexual images. How common is that where kids will take a picture of themselves and send it to a boyfriend or a friend or somebody they want to be a boyfriend or whomever, or girlfriend or whatever?
Yeah, as teenagers, it's not terribly common. The data varies, but around like 15, 25%, you often get in surveys, sometimes a little more. But as they get older, it gets much more common, right? So older teens, and then for, early 20s, it becomes very, very common that people are taking and sharing nudes. And so if we think about this developmentally, it's like with anything else. Again, we have to sort of scaffold those skills. So at the youngest ages, if they are using your phone, make sure that they know, sure, you can use my phone to take pictures, but we don't take pictures of nude bodies. And so, you sort of or we don't take pictures of people without asking them first, and we don't share people's pictures without asking them first. And then you build those skills. But the taking and sharing of nude images in adolescence and young adulthood does increase with age. And we also know that, not surprisingly, girls are much more often pressured to share nude images as teenagers.
Mm-hmm. And you're saying that what age we start this conversation? We start this conversation explicitly telling our kids we don't take pictures without permission. We don't take pictures of people without their clothes on, and you don't share. And we start that when they're asking to use our phones.
Yeah. And we model consent here as well. I mean, I know I often advise people, ask your child before you send a picture to the grandparents. And it's not, some people think, oh, that's overkill. I should be able to send pictures to the grandparents. But what does it hurt to ask them? And it models something for them. And I know in my family, I found that there are some pictures that they say, no, not that one. Or other times they might say, not that one, but send this one, to grandma. And so it just involves them a little bit. And then I saw as they got older, they would sometimes, say about things like, oh, that person didn't ask somebody, or I didn't like that my picture wound up somewhere without me being asked. So, you can integrate consent into these conversations too, because what you want them to know is that when they get into those middle school ages, when sometimes this stuff starts happening, that you want them to know that if one of their friends is sending pictures or posting things online without somebody's permission, that they can say, no, you should ask them first. Because we start to see a lot of that happening around, for some kids, fifth, sixth grade and up. Even around 10% of elementary age, like older elementary age kids have been sending pictures non-consensually, like nude-ish pictures to other kids. So, sometimes that startles people to hear that this is even happening with 9, 10, 11-year-olds, but it does on a much smaller scale. So we should be talking about that with them so they know not to do it.
And as parents, we know some of the real downsides of doing this. And without terrifying our kids, I think we have the obligation to say that once it's out there, you don't control it.
Yeah, I think we have obligations to let them know that, right? It's out there. We can't fix everything once it's out there on the internet. We can't just
Yeah.
take it down. But also some research has found that just again, not in a scare tactic type of way, but in a very plain, information type of way, we have also the obligation to say, look, it is illegal for people to take these nude images of minors. And if that happens, like schools have policies against these. So you talk with your kids about that and you say, there are laws in the community and there's also policies at school. And if people are sending and sharing nude images, they can be suspended from school. They may have the police come and talk with them and so on. And that can really be uncomfortable. So if you see people doing this or you're, go ahead and let me know, speak up. If you are being pressured, come talk with me and let me know, because nobody should be pressuring you for a nude image, even if they're your same age. No one should be pressuring you.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
let them know, because, in many US states, even the transmission of nude images of minors can be treated in the law as child pornography. And that is really a very difficult thing for many families to hear when their child
Mm-hmm.
gets caught up in this. And in other states, it's treated more of a developmental issue where there's still conversations with the family. They may remove device access for a kid. They may have them go through an education program, but it's really different than police involvement. So in the US, states vary widely on that, but we need to be real with our teenagers about what may happen so that they're not surprised or get caught up in something that they thought was maybe just harmless exploration.
And it seems, and I could be wrong on this, but it seems to me that most kids would respond even more strongly to the message of, once you send this picture, it can be resent to everyone. It can be resent over and over again. And even though you trust this person that you sent it to, if you break up, you don't know what's going to happen. Or if somebody gets their phone, you don't know what's going to happen. So if you don't want your principal to see it, if you don't want your teachers, if you don't want people in their actual lives now to see this picture, don't put it out there, because you have no control once it's out there.
Yeah, don't put it out there, and also don't ask for it, right? Especially what we find is a lot of,
Good point.
it could be people of any gender, but especially boys tend to ask for, sometimes they get more attention from their friends if they get pictures. So they may ask for it. There's some encouragement for schools to look at their policies. So it's not just about the sharing of images, which was more often getting girls in trouble, but the upstream behavior, which was the asking and nagging for the picture. So
Such a good point.
to say, if this is your friend or you care about this person, don't put them in that position, don't put them in a position where they feel pressured or they have to make choices around this. Just don't ask people for nude images,
Yeah. That's such a good point. I was focusing on the girls, but it's both. And I'm so glad you said that, because we need to be raising our sons as well. And not all boys are. It can be reversed. This is not just gender stereotyped, but generally speaking, it is boys who are asking or girls who are providing.
Yeah. And I think, we do want them to know that once the pictures are out there, we can't necessarily get them back and they can be widely shared. But we also want to say it in a way so that They know that if they do take and share an image, because again, many will, and if something it seems to spiral out of control, like you can still come to me for help. I'm going
Hmm.
to ask you not to do it. I don't think it's a good idea. Here's what can happen. But at the same time, we really don't want our kids to feel like there's no
Yeah.
way out, because there is this, it's less likely, but it does happen to, I mean, even at the middle school age, about 5% of kids, and the numbers increase at the high school age, what we call sextortion, which is where
Mhm.
somebody says, well, if you don't send me more pictures, I'm going to share this with your parents. And then what's going to
Mhm.
happen? Or I'm going to share this around school. I'm going to show your ex or your best friends, or I'm going to post it on the internet. And so then they use that as a way to get more pictures, or strangers on the internet will use that as a way to get more money. Sometimes kids make a mistake and they send a picture to some stranger on the internet. Maybe they thought it was a boyfriend or girlfriend or a friend or somebody their same age, and it turned out to be an adult. So we still want to tell our kids to exercise caution in these spaces. But look, if something happens, I will always be here to support you. I never want you to get caught in a situation where you feel like you've got to send more pictures or even like give money to keep something from happening. I will help you with this.
Hmm. Yeah, you're not in this alone, because it would just break my heart to think of a kid
Mhm.
trying to, and this even goes up to college age kids, that if
Absolutely.
they're dealing with it alone, that's a terrifying position to be in, and nobody should have to try to navigate that alone. Even if you as parents can't get the pictures back, which you can't, you could at least be there to support them and to say, okay, your worth is not tied up in this. This speaks more to the other person, and you can support them and, buy a pint of Ben and Jerry's and, and talk bad about the person.
Exactly. Yes.
Let me interrupt this interview just one more time to thank the Jockey Being Family Foundation for their support, both of this podcast all these years, but also for their support for our free courses that we offer. There are 12 courses. They are excellent. They're really focused on parenting, not pre-parenting, not to prepare you so much, but as once you're in the trenches of actually parenting, that's the focus of these courses. You can get them at bit.ly/JBF support. That's bit.ly/JBF support. All right, let's move on to pornography or sexually explicit media, because if anything has changed so dramatically with technology, it feels like the access. Now, I think most of us growing up, regardless of our age, had access to Playboy or Playgirl or even, National Geographic. I mean, we found ways of finding because we're curious and we were looking, but it's different now. The access is different now. So how common do kids access porn, and at what ages?
Yeah, so the average age these days, according to the Common Sense Media Report, which I had some involvement in, and as did other researchers about a year ago, found that the average age of first seeing pornography was 12. And again, that's an average, and it absolutely squares with what I hear from my college students. So we do know that some are seeing it at really young ages, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Others are seeing pornography for the first time in their teens, but the average is age 12, whether that's accidental or on purpose.
And what do you mean by accidental?
Well, maybe they were looking to learn about puberty.
Oh,
And,
mhm.
they were searching for some term, or they were searching for some phrase that they heard about at school or among their friends, and they didn't know what it meant. And they didn't know it was a sexual term. They Googled it, and then they found some pornographic images or explicit images.
Mhm.
Or other times, sometimes kids will tell us these things that they did. My students, often tell me these things that weren't around their middle school when they were growing up. They'll sometimes say, "Oh, well, like years ago, some of them said, oh, it was kind of like Penn Island." And I said, "What was Penn Island?" And then a few of them were laughing and say, "Oh, well, back when we were in middle school, it was a joke that people would say, like, go to pennisland.com. And Penn Island is actually stands for penis land." And I guess that, at some point, and this was now a million years ago, right, that there was some website where penis land actually had these, like pornographic types of images. So sometimes they have these like coded ways, or they'll tell somebody kind of like Rick rolling with like that Rick Astley song, but like you might say like it's a link to something else, but it's actually a link to porn. So sometimes kids find themselves on a pornography site because their friends were playing a little prank on them. And other times because they stumbled while looking for other information. And other times they are looking for sexual content because they've heard about it and they are curious and they want to see about it. So that's what I mean about kind of accidentally versus on purpose.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that we all know as parents or as adults that porn is bad for kids. That's an obvious statement. But you included some stats in the book, Yes, Your Kid, that I thought were, of course, anybody who listens to the show knows that I am a researcher. I am a research geek. Information is power in my world. So it probably speaks to partly why this was, I thought, so interesting. And I can't help but think it would be helpful for kids. And this is on page 177 of the book, Yes, Your Kid. I'm going to read this because it really stuck out for me. Whereas 90% of Americans had kissed one another during their most recent sexual experience, just 25% of porn scenes show kissing. And the thing that we had told our kids was, one of the things about porn is it's not real, but I would have loved to have been able to say, most people kiss when they're having sex, and that's not shown in porn. And here's another one. Although 1 in 4 young adults use a condom the last time they had sex, just 2 to 3% of pornographic scenes showed condom use. Here's another one. 2/3 of women experienced orgasm the last time they had sex, but women's orgasms were shown in just 12% of porn scenes. And here's another one. While 28% of adults engage in oral sex on the penis the last time they had sex, 66% of porn scenes showed this. And this will be the last one, but although just 4% of young adults had anal sex during their last sexual encounter, more than 4 times as many porn scenes showed anal sex between men and women. I think that's powerful for kids to realize. Just it gives evidence to the fact that porn is not real. And if you are watching it, you're going to be thinking that and it could be intimidating if nothing else, because it's so performative if nothing else.
It is. It's not real. And they really need to know that, because my college students, many of them do think that porn shows how sex is and what they should be doing. Some of them will use it kind of as a script. And, when I first started teaching human sexuality courses, 21 years ago now, I would get certain questions mainly about female sexuality and pleasure. How do I have an orgasm? Am I normal? Things like that. But just a few years into that, when we started having smartphones and the very widely accessible pornography, much more so even than just a few years earlier, I started getting all these questions about like anal sex and just this. And I would say, well, where do you get this expectation that you should be having anal sex? And overwhelmingly, like, well, that's what we see in pornography, right? And so we see that with lots of different behaviors, and it really helps, at least with my college students, it really helps them to see just what you described from the book. The differences from our research between what you actually see when you watch pornography versus the realities of people's sexual lives. And there's some things that the research has never even looked at. I wish somebody would, but I would suspect, for example, if we looked at the realities of real sex versus pornography, in real sex, we also generally see people looking in each other's eyes, and it's more personal. It's more intimate for the most part. And silly things happen sometimes, and funny things happen, and awkward moments. And porn does not show those realities. And, and it's not meant to. People will say, oh, it's just entertainment. It's arousal stuff. And that is the case. But when we think about where our kids are getting information about sexuality, many of them are turning toward pornography, or their friends are, or their partners are. So I often say, even if your kid has never watched pornography, there's a very good chance that their present or future partners will have, and their friends may have, some portion of their friends may have. And then when they talk about sort of what sex is and what you do when you're sexual with somebody, what becomes the norm for them often is what they have seen from pornography or what they've heard about in social media videos as well. And it's usually not reality.
So at what age should parents start talking with their kids about porn?
When I started as a sex educator and researcher, we had an older age for this. These days, we say 8 or 9. And we say 8 or 9 because most kids are seeing it by 12. And also because lots of kids are on the internet. Now, we don't say go into detail at these ages. Here's again where we get into little bits of information that are age and developmentally appropriate. And so for 8 or 9 year olds who might be starting to spend a little more time on the internet, again, like for me, I would say adult supervision if they're on the internet. But I will tell you, some of their friends will not have adult supervision. And if they don't, they may see some stuff at a play date or a sleepover, or their friends just may tell them stuff that they've seen at school. So even some information at ages 8 or 9 might be, we can even say, like, the reason I want to be in the room when you're on the internet or being here is because just like there are some shows or movies maybe that have sometimes been for older kids or for adults, and maybe you've seen them and you felt scared by them or had a nightmare from them. Well, there's also stuff on the internet that's by adults for adults. And sometimes kids wind up on those things accidentally. So I just want to be here to make sure that you're on the sites that are safe for kids. You maybe even you have some filters in your home to keep things safe for kids. And you just explain things, right? And like you might say, some of these things, for example, you might hear about from friends. We've talked about sexuality before. We've talked about how babies are made. Well, believe it or not, some people actually make some things on the internet that show like nude bodies and stuff, but it's really for other adults. And if you were to ever see these kinds of things at a friend's house, you can cover your eyes, you can walk out of the room. If you see these pictures of nude bodies or sexuality, I'm not going to be mad at you. I don't think they're what kids should be watching, but you can come to me with any questions that you have, and we can talk about that. So at those ages of 8, 9, 10, I mean, those are conversations that some families start to have just to let them know that it's out there. Many people think their kids aren't going to stumble upon, but again, the average age is 12. So some kids will. As they get older, then you have more, explicit conversations about pornography and about the kinds of sex that it shows around age 11 and 12, especially if you have boys. Boys more often see this younger than girls do. It's not perfect. Any gender can see it at any age, but overall, the research shows that. And we really want them to know that it's not real, that pornography shows impersonal sex. It doesn't show protected sex. And this is a great spot to bring in your values about what you think sexuality and intimacy are like or should be like versus what you see there. We regularly hear from families. I regularly hear from families who, again, are so surprised that their kids saw what they saw at the age that they saw. But if you can be the first one to let them know that this exists and to let them know that they can come to you, and also do what you can as a grown-up to keep those images out of their view by being thoughtful about device access, for example, then those are the best ways that we can delay their access to pornography. And we do now speak in our field about delaying access because it is unlikely for the vast majority of kids that you will prevent access to pornography throughout their adolescence.
All right. So a lot in our audience are foster parents or adoptive parents or kinship parents who are raising grandparents, raising a grandchild. So kids are coming into our families. I mean, some are adopted at birth or fostering at birth, but very often kids are coming into our families at an older age. We haven't had a lifetime of raising this child and building the relationship with this child. And very often these kids have come from environments where there wasn't parental supervision. There weren't, in fact, always that's the case. If they're functioning families don't end up with kids who are in the child welfare system. So how does that change how we discuss sex when it's already potentially and often an awkward conversation? How do we do that when we've got a child who may have been exposed to more than we would have liked and we haven't had them forever?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, again, thinking about technology access is always going to be a big thing. We see this with a lot of, I work sometimes with grandparents and talk about grandparents as sexuality educators. Some of them are raising the kids either entirely or primarily. And grandparents will often say that they could use especially some extra tips around technology and how to get support for having some apps that, like, Bark is one example. Common Sense Media has some great information about what apps and filters are available. There are some apps that can be on people's devices that will let you know what types of sites they're going to or what types of, images are being transmitted. Whatever the situation is, whatever the type of parent or caregiver or guardian, have an open conversation about technology and try to co-create rules. Because a lot of kids, right, especially when they have moved from home to home and they have been subjected to different kinds of rules, well, part of it is deciding like, what is this family environment going to be like for you? And not just springing things on them where they can't be trusted or they feel like people are spying on them. Having high quality books like you talked about as well.
Oh, yes. And that's one that doesn't require you to have conversations per se, although I always think it's good to follow up.
Yeah. For all kids, we recommend like working on the rules together, but also letting them know like, what is or isn't going to be acceptable in the home, especially if there's younger kids in the home. For anyone who has some older kids or teens in there, or kids who have just seen a lot, been through a lot, but we still have to have conversations about how we're going to keep everybody in the home safe and protected too.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Debbie Herbenick, the author of Yes, Your Kid, What Parents Need to Know About Today's Teens and Sex. Thank you so much for being our guest today. This has been enlightening, and I enjoyed the book, and I highly recommend it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before you leave, I have one more thing I want to tell you, and that is our partner announcement. We have partners who have supported us, and this particular partner has been a long-term supporter of Creating a Family, the nonprofit, and our mission, and of this podcast. They are Children's Connection. They are an adoption agency providing services for domestic infant adoption, placing babies throughout the U.S. They also do home studies and post-adoption support for families in Texas. Thank you, Children's Connection, for your long-term support of Creating a Family.